All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're here on LinkedIn Live, Emtrain's LinkedIn Live. My name is Leann Pereira, and I'm the Senior Director of Organizational Psychology here at Emtrain. Today, we're joined by Nicolette Kalbfell, who is a Senior Executive Communications Specialist. Nicolette is joining us from Germany. Hello, Nicolette, and welcome to our show today.
Hi, Leann. Thanks for having me.
Now, Nicolette, I don't know if everybody knows what an executive communications specialist is. So could you give us a little bit of a background on what it is and what you do?
Yeah, so depending on the size of an organization, you'll have your communications department. And in a perfect world, every major portion of your business would have a communications business partner. And those business partners would be working together on messaging and making sure that you're combining what the company or the organization wants to get out to the world or into employees, and combining that with that individual. So I find executive comms so interesting because you're combining a unique person with unique characteristics, personality, background, story, interests, weaknesses, strengths with company or organizational messaging. And you need to combine those two elements to achieve what you're trying to do: inform an audience, inspire them, encourage them to make a behavioral change. So yeah, that's how I would define it.
And that's really fascinating because I never thought of it as combining an individual with an organizational message, but isn't that exactly what it is? And so
yeah, and that's actually what makes it so interesting for me, because every person has a unique story. And the more you get to know them, the more you become aware of kind of what's the most compelling parts of their story. And that can be used to make communications more valuable and interesting for the audiences you're trying to reach.
wow, that is really, so when you say story, I think of a person's identity and something that's constantly emerging and developing. So you're actually working with a live moving narrative, right? So
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it makes me think of one of our global heads of diversity and inclusion that I got to work with for a number of years. When she first told me that she had spent the first 15 years of her career doing finance for the company we worked for, and had slowly started to get involved in D&I programming and just really built up an interest. And she thought that it was irrelevant that she used to work in finance. And personally, I said, but that's so super interesting. And it shows that part of your story, shows your passion for a topic, your willingness to learn, your willingness to change. And isn't that what you're trying to inspire other people to do? So part of the role of the communications business partner is to be able to identify those kind of gems and encourage that person to not feel vulnerable in using them to lead, really.
and I think that's super important for D&I work, which is going to be something that I'd like to explore a little bit with you today, because there are so many questions around authenticity and honesty. And one of the things you mentioned as we were preparing for this call or this talk was that your job is to be as honest and clear as possible. And that really struck me because I think that there's a belief that there's a very managed communication, and maybe authenticity and honesty isn't the very, very top priority. So could you say a little bit about that? Because I think it's really important, especially as we tackle topics like inclusion and diversity.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's always various levels of complexity depending on what the message is that needs to come out. Sometimes in organizations at certain points, there are things that legally can't be shared that employees really would like to know about, and you just can't do it, But in general, I think my brain gets excited about writing and scripting and things like that, because it's kind of like a little bit like a puzzle or a math equation where you want to find the way to be respectful, to recognize the moment, to manage the complexities, but to give as much clarity as possible. Because at the end of the day, I guess I always kind of see myself as a news reporter, even though I haven't been for many, many years. It's your moral obligation. If you're going to get up and say something, or you're going to write something and send it out, then you need to share as much as you can, as clearly as possible. So yeah, that's how I look at it.
And I think that that's amazing and fantastic. So thank you for clarifying that for me, because I wasn't quite sure. I didn't know very much about the art of executive communications and messaging, and just how seriously clarity and truth is a guiding principle in that. And I think that's really important for inclusion and diversity practitioners. So let's talk about inclusion and diversity.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is important to communicate as an executive who wants to move an inclusion and diversity initiative forward? What are some of the things that you have found to be most helpful?
Well, in my experience, I think any particular leader, whether it's the CEO of an entire company or an executive representing a certain arm of an organization, you need to have something to say. You need to put your money where your mouth is. And in the years that I was doing D&I communications at a large pharmaceutical company, I was able to observe a shift from D&I basically meant talking about how many women we had in leadership positions, to fast forward a few years, and with the right kind of an intention and time and resource dedication, we had built up a fairly excited and energized LGBTQ community. We had a very engaged introvert community. There was a lot going on around formalizing a flexible working policy, which might seem kind of like an old idea now after Corona and home office for our entire lives. But actually 3 or 4 years ago, at a global company where the legal laws in different countries are all different, that was actually quite a big deal to formalize. So I think a leader has to be prepared to do concrete things. But the good thing is that those don't have to be major global initiatives. It can be as simple as, in my experience, a CEO agreeing to fly the rainbow flag at our headquarters in a small conservative town in Bavaria, Germany. It could be as simple as the CEO sending out an email of support for Pride Month. It could be as simple as attending an event and showing that you really care. But you need to have those proof points. Otherwise, it's not going to look authentic. It's not going to look true. So I guess if I was coaching an executive who said, I really want to get out there and show my support, I would say, fantastic, but we have to be able to back it up. So if you don't have the time to really engage, then maybe that's not the right way to go right now.
So it sounds like starting out, there may be an open slate where, the executive comes out and says something, and then you have some leeway, but you have to follow it up with some proof points. So you may fly the flag, but if you're doing that, then it sounds as if there has to be something that comes next, and that now they're actually starting a story, right? Or a narrative around this. Is that true?
Yeah, exactly. That's the ideal scenario where you start a story, So if you've got an executive, for example, a great opportunity is coming into a new role, and saying, well, in addition to my responsibilities as chief financial officer, I'm very passionate about this particular topic, and I'm committed to moving the needle for the company there, because I understand I'm in a position of power and influence. And by the way, as a communications person, you also, and this was something I didn't realize when I first went into the career, you're the one proposing the words. You're the one proposing the speaking opportunities, proposing what they say at events, proposing the slides. And there's a lot of power in that to suggest. So I certainly never thought of myself as any type of an expert in this particular area, but I realized that I could also influence what a leader ended up saying, simply by proposing that they think about the wording in a slightly different way.
So you, in a way, in a very real way, have to have some expertise on whatever it is you're trying to communicate.
Yeah, that's kind of the interesting catch-22. You're often writing for somebody, and you need to know that person, but you also need to know their field, and you need to understand what everybody in that field, is saying outside of the organization, what works inside, what's going on outside. Does this person want to be a thought leader in this field? Are they fine to just kind of do the bare minimum? What are we going for here? And you're very instrumental in facilitating that, because you're helping them craft what they say when they get up on stage in front of 1,000 people in a room, or what images they decide to show on the slide behind them. And all of that can add up.
What happens when, just as an aside, we had a lot of things happen in the US over the last year, George Floyd's murder being a huge part of that. And I noticed that after such a thing happened, that some organizations took what I would consider a fair amount of time to respond. And I didn't know how to interpret that. Some organizations and leaders stepped up and clearly said this was wrong and we must do something about it. But some organizations took longer. What do you think, in the light of something that happens like that? It's, day one or day two. What is your advice to folks on how to respond to these types of events?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly within the field of communications as well. I would say it's a new chapter, because the frequency with which we as a society and organizations are being presented with challenging topics and needing to respond, that has just shot up, right? And so, and perhaps that's good, because people then need to get into the rhythm of being ready to have something to say. So, yeah, I think that's not ideal. Taking a long time to respond to something is never good, because it shows the obvious fact that you don't know what you want to say about it. And what's likely going on is, leaders at the top are figuring out what exactly are we going to say, and weighing the pros and cons of various opinions. And people know that. So you want to get out as fast as you can. But it doesn't have to be highly complex. You want to say something as soon as you can, but it can be one or two sentences. But then you got to keep coming back, once the more details you get around it. And again, don't make the mistake of committing to massive change and movements that you're not really certain you can back up, because then you run the risk internally of losing faith with employees, and then reputationally outside of the company, that can be quite damaging as well. So, but you're right. Speed of response is best.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a fine line, and I love your point that it could be simple, but it should be quick, and then decide and be transparent perhaps about that learning. And I think that goes to a question that we have by one of our participants. So the question is, do you feel leaders are the ones who need education around those topics first? So I think this goes back to the comment where we said, Nicolette, as a communication specialist, you need to know a lot. Where's that balance between what you know and what the leader knows? Like, how do you negotiate the gaps?
Well, I need to know what questions to ask. I need to know what wording is going to be clear and authentic and respectful, as well as powerful enough to get people's attention. Otherwise, it's just blah blah. I think the leader needs to be the content expert in his or her field. But when it comes to some of these particular, situations we've had in the past year or so, I think the best scenario is that if you don't already have a head of D&I, if you don't already have that capability within your human resources or people and organizational department, that that you better get some consult quickly. It's like anything else. If you're trying to make a decision on something to do with your taxes, you need to get an expert on that. So I think in a situation where you've got a leader that needs to make a comment but is not an expert on what they're commenting on, it's my role to say, well, we need to say something. So what are we comfortable saying now? We need to tell people when we're coming back to say more. And in that meantime, we need to upscale our understanding of the situation so you can make an honest commitment from there on.
No, I think that's super important. So what you're saying is, event happens, communications role is to make sure that there is a response and that it is a reasonable one given what the resources of the organization is and what the focus is. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It should not be overreaching, is what I'm hearing from you, is like really try to be as succinct and reasonable and accurate, right? Back to those principles, those journalistic principles.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because like I said before, you run the risk of overextending yourself and then having to explain in 6 months' time why you haven't achieved this big blue sky vision.
Okay. And you say, like D&I, and I love this because this is something that I believe deeply. D&I is really a domain expertise. So one wouldn't necessarily be making this up as we go along, right? There is a knowledge domain, and companies should be consulting experts. Have you seen organizations not do that, or have you always been part of organizations that have been well equipped and well educated, good resources?
No, not always. I have been part of large organizations that always had a head of D&I, but that person didn't really, didn't have a team per se. I think what was something interesting that I noticed was there are, of course, experts in certain groups within the company. So when you don't have a lot of dedicated D&I, expert consultants or people who have really thought deeply about these issues, written about it, spoken about it, et cetera, you already have those employee resource groups, hopefully, within your organization that you can tap into. So, for example, with our LGBTQ group at Sandoz, they knew what they needed. They knew what they wanted. The problem was that there was no connector. The head of D&I was in full support, like, yeah, you guys go ahead and go. But they didn't have that connector person to kind of define it and just, get the intranet page up, get the social media posts created, book the room for the event that everybody ended up being super inspired by, film the video so we can share those messages with the other 60 countries in the network. So I think you don't have to have a team of 5 or 10 experts if you're talking to those groups you're trying to engage regularly and again, taking real action with them.
Another gem, Nicolette. So what we like to say is ask those people who know, right? And so I think sometimes perhaps there's a view that there's only a couple, that communications may be insular. And what I'm hearing you say, it's only that way when it's not done well. That good communications practices literally communicates with people and gets the information.
That's it. That's it. I mean, again, the authenticity. I wouldn't be able to write about a group of people, without sitting with them, without having lunch with them, without understanding what they're frustrated about. But all that takes time and regular touch points, and that's of course often a challenge for companies when they perceive other priorities. So.
Nicolette, so I'm hearing a little bit of the investigative journalist coming out in you, and I love that because, of course, as a psychologist, I love the human aspect, the understanding other people's experiences. Just the research. Do you think that there's a problem, or what happens? I mean, why does that go awry? Why is it that there are bad, quote unquote, communications practices, if there are? And I'm saying,
Sure.
yeah, I mean, how does that go wrong? Like, what happens?
Well, I think it goes wrong when a company tries to join a conversation and they haven't done their homework. When you just try to join in to say, yeah, we believe the same, but as soon as somebody scratches the surface and says, well, what do you mean? What are you going to do here? Who have you spoken with about this? Why do you care? Then they're going to be in trouble. There's a pretty foundational practice of any communications professional. If you're going out with an announcement, a press release, let's say, you define that text, but then in the background, you're creating a Q&A document where you basically put on the hat of the super aggressive, angry journalist and come up with all the really terrible questions you can think of around that announcement. And so that always takes a lot of time, and people are never super happy to do that exercise, but it typically exposes some weakness in the original announcement to begin with. So yeah, I think it's just kind of that laziness. People think it's urgent and they gotta go out with something. But these topics are sensitive and are personal to a lot of people. So it's very important that whoever comes out to make a statement is coming from a place of authenticity, and fortunately, unfortunately, whatever, that takes time. So.
And I think, again, that speaks to the question that was posed around how are leaders responsible for what they're saying. And what I'm hearing is it really takes a team of people who are dedicated to finding out what the story is, what the experiences are, and then educating. That education is something that happens together as a group. And it's not that the leader has to be an expert immediately off the bat when something hits the ground, but there is a process of discovery, and we have to really allow and support that to happen, and to bring other people into the conversation. And I think that is exactly what inclusion and diversity is about now, isn't it?
Yeah, it can be as easy as making time to spend time, and of course, one leader can't do everything. So you have to pick, and you have to decide, where am I really going to, invest? But then that person can speak with authenticity and communicate about that, and hopefully move the needle with various initiatives on that one particular topic, or whatever they may have time and resource for.
And speaking of time, we only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask you about your greatest success in communicating and moving the needle with an inclusion and diversity initiative. What would you say that was?
Um, well, I think helping groups of employees find their voice after kind of hitting their heads against the wall for a long time and realizing that all I had to do to really facilitate that was share a bit more of my time. And and that things that might seem kind of crazy and very different are really not. When I helped the CEO of our company send out a simple email in support of Pride Month, doesn't sound like a big deal now, but 3 or 4 years ago, that was a very big deal for us. It had never happened before. And we actually got some kickback from countries like Egypt, where they said, hey, homosexuality is illegal here. We don't agree with getting emails like this. But to a certain group of people, that email, I mean, they printed it out, so I guess that's probably what most people would say, is that it's little things that end up making a big difference for other people. And honestly, I was having fun. I was making new friends. We were just, so yeah. And I'm not at that company anymore, but that group continues to be very active. And yeah, I think if I had to pick, it would be that. Little things that make a big difference.
Nicolette, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise with us and that wonderful story, and for the work that you're doing, because it definitely takes not just a village, a community, it just takes the world, right?
Yeah, yes, so, definitely.
I hope your evening is wonderful in Germany. Before we sign off, I want to open it up and see, first of all, do you have any comments that you'd like to leave us with? And second, Hasina, are there any other questions that have come up? Hasina says no other questions. And so, Nicolette, anything else? Any parting comments?
No, I just, I do feel quite, I guess, grateful that something that, a topic that I didn't set out to study, I get to communicate about. And yeah, it's rewarding for me. So I enjoy it.
Alrighty. And folks, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to write in. We'll make sure that Nicolette gets them. Otherwise, we'll look forward to seeing you next time on LinkedIn Live. Thank you.
Thanks, Leann.